The house was quiet as it always was at that hour. Outside, the wind scraped softly against the windows, and the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock was the only sign that time hadn't stopped. Inside the living room, the late autumn sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains, casting long silvery shadows on the floor. Rachel Moore sat at the edge of the couch, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long since lost its warmth. Across the room, Ethan lay curled up on the sofa, his knees drawn to his chest, a soft knitted blanket wrapped tightly around his trembling frame. He hadn't eaten since the previous evening. His face had grown paler over the past few weeks, as if the color had quietly slipped away with each passing day. Rachel watched him with the silent worry of a mother who had run out of ways to coax comfort. There had been no fever, no rash, nothing visible, just that ever-present pain in his stomach. It came and went in cruel waves, leaving him moaning softly into the pillows or gripping the table edge as if the world itself might shift beneath his feet. He had stopped going to school. He had stopped drawing. He had stopped laughing. He had stopped being 9. Rachel remembered when Ethan used to run through the halls of their small apartment, his laughter echoing like birdsong at sunrise. Now the boy before her seemed like a ghost of that child, a faded memory hanging by a thread. She reached out and gently placed her palm on his forehead. No fever, but a fine sheen of sweat had broken along his brow and above his lips. His skin was clammy, his breath shallow. Still, his eyes, those wide, intelligent eyes, remained open, staring into the fabric of the couch as if he were listening to something only he could hear. She whispered his name, her voice like a leaf brushing the surface of a pond. He didn't move, only closed his eyes tighter as if afraid her voice might pull him from a place he wasn't ready to leave. For nearly a month, this silent war had waged between them. Rachel desperate to bring him to the doctor, Ethan terrified of crossing the threshold of any medical office. He had always been brave, never once cried during vaccinations, never feared dentists, or even blood draws. But now, the mere mention of hospital caused his body to recoil violently as though the word itself carried pain. She remembered the first time she had tried. They were halfway down the stairwell of their apartment building when he suddenly screamed like he was being burned alive, and clung to the railing with such ferocity that his fingers bled. He kicked, he flailed, he sobbed, and then just as suddenly he collapsed into silence, hiding beneath the coat rack in the corner, shivering and refusing to come out for hours. It wasn't tantrum. It was trauma. Rachel never forgot the way his body folded inward that day, like he was trying to disappear into himself. A few days later, she tried again, softly suggesting a friendly checkup. Ethan's lips barely moved, but his words were etched in fear. "Don't make me go. Please, Mom. Please don't." She had relented. Now, sitting in the same room, watching her son twist quietly in pain, she questioned her choice. How long could he go on like this? How long could she wait? When was protecting him? No longer protection at all. She took another sip of her cold tea, wishing it had the power to calm her. She had thought about calling an ambulance more than once, but the image of Ethan panicking, screaming, clawing at her arms, kept her frozen every time. The doctors couldn't help if they couldn't even see him. The doorbell rang, soft and distant. She almost didn't hear it. Rachel opened the door to see Edith Williams standing in her cardigan and slippers holding a small covered dish. Her face, lined with age, wore the expression of someone who had lived long enough to recognize silent suffering when she saw it. "I made some chicken broth," Edith said softly. "Thought maybe Ethan might sip a bit." Rachel accepted the dish with a grateful nod. "Thank you. He hasn't eaten since yesterday." Edith's eyes darted toward the inside of the apartment. "Still no doctor." "He won't go," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I've tried everything." Edith pressed her lips together. "When you lived with that man—" "Tyler was it," Rachel stiffened. "Yes. There were nights I saw him on the balcony, smoking, talking to himself. I remember once around 2 a.m. he was holding Ethan, just standing there in the dark." Rachel's breath hitched. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Edith continued, But the boy's eyes, they were wide open, frozen. Rachel thanked her again and closed the door. Her thoughts churned, reaching for fragments she had buried long ago. Tyler Grant. The name itself carried weight, regret, shame, confusion. They had broken up 3 years ago, and she had convinced herself that Ethan had moved on just as she had. But had he? She turned to look at her son. Ethan lay unmoving now, his breathing soft but steady. In his small hand, clutched tightly to his chest, was the corner of the blanket he'd had since infancy. A worn, pale blue cloth with clouds faded from hundreds of washes. Rachel sat beside him and whispered, "I don't know what's happening inside you, Ethan, but I promise I will find a way to help you." Outside, the sky turned the color of ash as the evening folded into night. The city stirred under the dimming light, and in the distance a storm began to gather, slow, patient, inevitable. The night wore on like a bruise spreading across the sky. Rachel paced quietly in the kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator and the creak of every step on the linoleum amplifying the silence. She had reheated the chicken broth, poured it into a small bowl, and stirred it absently, watching the steam spiral upward like ghosts with nowhere to go. She glanced down the hallway every few minutes, ears straining for a sound from Ethan's room, but nothing came. Just silence. A silence too loud. Her mind wandered unwillingly to the shadows of 3 years ago, to the man who had once occupied that very apartment with her and her son. Tyler Grant. He had been charming at first, unapologetically charismatic with a mischievous grin and eyes that always seemed to be searching for something just out of reach. A musician, he had said. A dreamer, she had believed. But dreams can rot in silence. There had been no bruises, no screaming matches, just the slow erosion of joy, the turning of a home into something cautious and cold. Tyler had moods, deep valleys that swallowed whole days of light. There were nights he wouldn't sleep, muttering to himself in the balcony chair while Ethan played alone on the carpet. Sometimes Rachel would find him staring at Ethan too long, as if seeing something she couldn't. And one night, she had found him whispering to the child, offering a strange white capsule and calling it sleeping candy. She had confronted him. He had laughed. "You overthink everything, Rachel. It's a melatonin gummy." He couldn't sleep, but Ethan had never mentioned trouble sleeping before, and he never mentioned that night again. When Tyler left, there had been no tears, no fights, just the sharp click of the door closing. Rachel thought it was over. She thought Ethan was safe. Now, watching her son wither from within, she wondered what she had missed. She carried the bowl down the hall, nudged the door open with her shoulder. Ethan was lying on his side facing the wall, his back rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She sat on the edge of the bed, ran her fingers gently through his damp hair. "I made your favorite," she said softly, even though she knew he wasn't listening. "I put stars in it." She added a smile in her voice, just like we used to pretend. She dipped the spoon and brought it to his lips. He turned away. "Please, Ethan, just one sip." But he didn't open his mouth. Instead, he clutched his stomach and whimpered. That sound, like the mewling of an injured animal, broke something inside her. Rachel placed the bowl on the nightstand and pulled the blanket around him. She lay beside him, wrapping her arms gently around his thin frame. His heartbeat was fast, uneven. She didn't sleep. The hours ticked by. Sometime near dawn, she was stirred by a retching sound. Ethan bolted upright, a hand pressed to his mouth. Before she could react, he was vomiting over the edge of the bed. She turned on the light. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just bile. There was blood. Rachel screamed. The bowl from the nightstand crashed to the floor, shards scattering beneath their feet. She wrapped a towel around Ethan and lifted him into her arms. His body was limp, his eyes fluttering closed. There was no time to think. Barefoot, coatless, trembling, Rachel ran into the street with her son in her arms. The sky was still dark, the street lamps flickering weakly above. A car passed. Another, and then a cab. She stepped into the road. The driver slammed the brakes. "Please," she cried. "Hospital, now." The driver, wide-eyed, nodded. In the back seat, Rachel held Ethan tightly, whispering his name over and over. His lips were tinged with blue. At the entrance of Los Angeles General, the emergency doors opened like the mouth of fate. A nurse appeared pushing a stretcher. She was young, with a calm urgency in her movements. Her name tag read Amelia Tran. "How long has he been vomiting?" she asked. 10 minutes? Maybe more, Rachel stammered. But the pain. Weeks. I didn't know. Take a deep breath, Amelia said gently, placing her hand on Rachel's shoulder. We've got him. Doctors rushed in and Ethan disappeared behind the double doors. Rachel was left in the sterile hallway, clutching the corner of his blanket in her shaking hands. It was then that she saw him, Dr. Samuel Hayes, walking with purpose, a quiet intensity surrounding him like a shroud. He looked to be in his late 50s, silver at the temples, with eyes that had seen more than most people should. He didn't speak much, just nodded to the nurse and vanished into the operating room. Inside, the scans began. An ultrasound, a CT. Rachel sat with Amelia, answering questions mechanically. No allergies, no medical history. He's always been healthy. Always. She stared at the floor tiles, counting the cracks between them. Anything to keep herself from thinking about what might happen if he didn't come back through those doors. Dr. Hayes reviewed the images in silence. There it was, a foreign object. Long, tubular, roughly 9 inches. He leaned closer, wrapped in something that looked like nylon. Impossible, he murmured. How did that get inside a child? They prepped for endoscopy. Ethan's breathing was shallow but stable. Anesthesia was administered. A scope inserted. On the monitor, the object appeared clearly foreign, out of place, leaching darkness into the soft pink walls of a child's stomach. Wrapped, sealed, rotting. Stop, Hayes instructed. It's deteriorating. If we try to pull it out this way, we risk rupture. He turned to Amelia. Prep for surgery. Outside, Rachel watched the commotion, her heart thudding in her ears. When Hayes approached, she stood feeling the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears pressing on her chest. We need to operate, he said. There's something inside his stomach. We don't know what it is, but it's large. It may be infected. She staggered. An object. Like something he ate. It's not something a child swallows accidentally. The words pierced through her like a blade. She clung to Amelia's arm to keep from falling. And then, like a slide flickering to life in her memory, she remembered it. The night Ethan refused to sleep. The white capsule. The words Tyler had used, sleeping candy. Her legs buckled. She remembered the way Ethan had looked at her afterward, not with fear, but with betrayal. She had brushed it off. Now she wanted to scream, but there was no time. Please, she said, choking on the word, save my son. Dr. Hayes gave a firm nod. I promise you, we will do everything. He turned and disappeared through the surgical doors. Rachel sank into the chair. Amelia placed a warm blanket around her shoulders and handed her a cup of water. She held it, but did not drink. Outside, the first rays of morning were beginning to stretch across the horizon. But inside the hospital, the night had only just begun. The operating room stood still in a silence that wasn't quiet. Monitors beeped in steady rhythms, steel instruments gleamed under surgical lights, and the air carried the sterile scent of antiseptic and adrenaline. Ethan Moore lay on the table, small and pale, his body covered by sterile sheets, his chest rising and falling with the slow, measured breath of sedation. The fluorescent glow made his skin appear almost translucent, the bones of his face delicate and sharp like porcelain. Dr. Samuel Hayes stood over the table with a gaze that was both clinical and compassionate. He had seen hundreds of surgeries in his long career, but something about this child made his fingers pause just a beat longer before touching the scalpel. Maybe it was the way Ethan's small hand twitched almost imperceptibly, as if his body, even under anesthesia, was still resisting something unseen. Beside him, Nurse Pedro Morales prepared the tools steady, precise. His gloves snapped on. His breath was shallow but steady. Amelia Tran, now in full surgical attire, kept her eyes on the monitors, her hand resting just beside the boy's tiny wrist. "Ultrasound confirms positioning," Pedro said softly. "Foreign object located lower gastric region, length approximately 9 inches. Dr. Hayes didn't respond at first. He simply inhaled deeply and made the first incision gentle, deliberate, clean. The layers of tissue opened beneath his skilled hands like pages of a worn book, each layer revealing another unanswered question. There was minimal bleeding, but the deeper they moved, the more discolored the tissue became, swollen, bruised, angry. The stomach lining was stretched unnaturally, and the smell of acid mingled with decay hung in the air like a quiet scream. "Puss," Pocket Hayes murmured. "We'll need to aspirate before we proceed." Pedro inserted the suction tube, removing the bile-colored fluid with practiced precision. The fluid hissed and disappeared into the vacuum canister, carrying with it the rot of something long hidden. And then, under the bright light, they saw it. An edge. Yellowed, warped. Wrapped in layers of what appeared to be deteriorated plastic. Mold clung to its surface. The tissue around it was inflamed, nearly blistered from contact. Hayes paused. "Begin gentle extraction." Pedro steadied the clamps. Amelia adjusted the monitor feed. Slowly, with infinite care, Dr. Hayes grasped the edge of the object and began to pull. It emerged reluctantly, inch by inch, revealing itself not as food, not as any benign item, but as a tube sealed at both ends, slick with mucus, brittle from exposure. A collective breath held. It wasn't a toy. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Dr. Hayes laid the object on a stainless steel tray. The clang of it against metal echoed like a verdict. The surgical team stood silent, the implications beginning to settle like ash after a fire. "There's fungal growth," Amelia observed quietly. "It's been inside him for weeks, maybe longer. No rupture." "We're lucky," Hayes replied, "but the infection around it's extensive." They began irrigation, cleansing the infected tissues, administering localized antibiotics, closing the stomach walls layer by layer. But something shifted in Dr. Hayes's posture. It wasn't just a surgical concern anymore. It was suspicion. Outside the OR, Rachel sat in the hallway, her fingers wrapped tightly around the chain of the rosary Ethan had made in Sunday school. Bright plastic beads, some chipped, some missing. She hadn't prayed in years. But in that moment, every breath she took was a plea to something greater. The double doors opened, and Nurse Amelia stepped out first, her face calm but unreadable. "He's stable," she said. "He's still under sedation, but the object is out." Rachel stood slowly, the weight in her legs making her feel as if she'd aged 10 years in an hour. What was it she asked? Dr. Hayes approached, removing his gloves. A tube, roughly the size of a thick marker. Sealed. Moldy. It's been there for some time. Rachel covered her mouth. "It wasn't something a child would swallow willingly," he added, voice gentle but firm. The air around her changed, thickened, her lungs struggled to fill. Tyler. Word wasn't spoken, but it screamed inside her skull. She collapsed into the chair, her hands trembling. 1,000 memories rushed to the surface like floodwaters breaking a dam. The late nights, the shadows, the way Ethan had stopped sleeping, the night she caught Tyler offering that candy. What had he done? What had Ethan been forced to hide? She looked up, tears in her eyes. "Will he recover?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "With antibiotics and care, yes. Physically." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Emotionally was another story. In the days that followed, Ethan remained in the pediatric ward under watchful care. Amelia often sat beside him during the night shifts, gently humming songs from her childhood in Vietnam, her voice soft and grounding. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat. Rachel stayed too, never far, her eyes fixed on her son, studying every rise and fall of his chest, every furrow in his brow. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the sterile sheets, Ethan stirred. His lashes fluttered. His mouth opened dry and hesitant. And then, barely above a whisper, "I didn't mean to." I didn't mean to keep it." Rachel moved closer. "What, sweetheart?" His lips trembled. "He said it was candy, but it burned inside." She froze. Ethan turned away. "I didn't tell you. I was scared." She wanted to say it wasn't his fault, that no child should ever carry such a burden. But all she could do was hold him and whisper, I know now." Outside the window, the city stirred awake. Life continued, cars passed, birds called. But in that hospital room, time paused for just a moment longer, holding space for truth, for healing, for the quiet beginning of forgiveness. Morning light poured through the tall windows of the pediatric recovery room, filtering through the blinds in thin ribbons that striped the white sheets like fragile bars. Ethan lay still, his body curled slightly on its side, a faint shadow of the boy who once ran barefoot across the living room floor, chasing dust motes in the sun. The machines beside him hummed softly. An IV line connected to his small arm where adhesive tape barely held against the movement of sleep. A faint bruise was forming near the needle site, another mark, like so many invisible ones written across a childhood interrupted. Rachel sat in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't left the hospital since the surgery. Not for coffee, not for rest. The fatigue clung to her like an old coat she couldn't shrug off. Her eyes, rimmed with red, remained fixed on her son. Her guilt, however, had begun to take form, no longer just a feeling, but a tangible thing with shape and breath and weight. She remembered the early signs. Ethan had once flinched when someone reached for him too quickly. He stopped sleeping through the night. He stopped asking questions. And worst of all, he stopped trusting touch. She had chalked it up to the divorce. The tension. The transitions. Children were resilient, people said. He just needed time. But time had allowed something to fester, and now the truth of it sat like a stone in her throat. A knock at the door broke the silence. Amelia entered, gentle as always, holding a clipboard and a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She greeted Rachel, quietly checked the machines, and adjusted Ethan's pillow. "He's stable," she said softly. "Vitals are improving. He's sleeping more deeply now." Rachel nodded, her voice stuck somewhere behind her ribs. Amelia lingered for a moment, then set the clipboard aside. "I sat with him last night," she said. "He woke up around 3. He didn't say much, just stared at the ceiling." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "He's not the same." "No," Amelia replied gently, "but no one is after surviving something they couldn't name." There was a pause. Then Amelia added, "Children who've been hurt often carry the wound like silence. They don't always scream. Sometimes they just stop singing." Rachel lowered her head. "I should have seen it. I should have—" "You're seeing it now," Amelia interrupted, not unkindly. "That's what matters." Ethan stirred, slightly shifting beneath the blanket. His breathing was shallow but steady. Rachel moved to his side, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. She whispered more to herself than to him. "I didn't protect you." The room didn't answer, but the stillness did. Later that day, Dr. Hayes arrived with the pathology report and the object in a sealed evidence bag now labeled and logged. The tube was grimy, its surface warped by time and heat. A sticker with faded cartoon characters still clung to one side. "Likely ingested months ago," he said. "We believe it was filled with sleeping pills wrapped to bypass taste." Rachel stared at the bag. The image of Tyler's hand offering something to Ethan played again in her mind like a broken film reel. She nodded numbly. "We've contacted social services," Hayes continued. "There will be questions. A formal investigation. I understand. I don't say this lightly, Miss Moore, but what your son endured, it wasn't accidental. She already knew. She had always known somewhere deep down beneath the layers of denial and distraction. She had just never given the truth permission to rise." That evening, she returned to Ethan's room and found him awake, staring out the window. The sunset painted the walls in hues of fire and gold. She approached slowly, unsure of how to begin. He didn't look at her. "I remember the stars," he said suddenly. She froze. That night, he told me to close my eyes and count the stars. Then he gave me the candy. Rachel knelt beside him, her hands trembling. You don't have to talk about it now. Ethan turned his eyes cloudy but dry. He said if I told anyone the stars would disappear. Rachel bit her lip to keep from crying. I didn't want to lose the stars, Ethan whispered. You won't, she said, voice cracking. You won't lose them ever again. He nodded, but his face remained unreadable. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Rachel stood by the window watching the parking lot shimmer under streetlights. She thought about the man who had once shared her home, the man she had loved, the man who had hidden monsters inside bedtime stories. She didn't know what would come next. The police would investigate. Child welfare would open a case. Legal battles might follow, but none of that terrified her anymore. What frightened her most was how much of Ethan's childhood had already been stolen, and whether she could help him reclaim even a fraction of it. She turned back to his bed, saw his hand resting loosely on his chest, and suddenly she knew. It wasn't about going back. It was about carrying forward together. The hospital room, once heavy with dread and silence, had begun to change. It no longer held the echo of alarms or the rustle of panic, but rather the steady rhythm of stillness measured patient fragile. A paper snowflake Ethan had made in school months ago now hung on the window. A small teddy bear sat tucked beside his pillow. Healing, Rachel had come to realize, did not begin with miracles. It began in small things. The quiet kind. Ethan had been moved out of intensive care and into a private recovery suite. He spoke rarely, but his eyes followed the movement of light on the walls. He watched the nurses, the soft sweep of their shoes against linoleum. And when Rachel sat beside him sometimes, just sometimes, he'd let his fingers find hers. There were still moments when he recoiled from touch. When a door clicked too loudly or a stranger entered the room too quickly, he would shrink inward, his shoulders curling protectively as if remembering a time when shrinking had been his only defense. But more often now, he allowed the world to exist around him without flinching. Rachel spent her days by his side reading aloud from books with gentle endings describing the trees outside or simply watching the sunlight change direction across the floor. One afternoon, Nurse Amelia returned with someone new. "This is Edith," she said softly, kneeling beside Ethan. "She's a friend. She's very good at listening. Would it be okay if she sat with you for a little while?" Ethan didn't speak, but his fingers gripped the hem of his blanket. After a pause, he gave the faintest nod. Edith Williams was a trauma counselor, mid-40s calm presence, her gray sweater matching the softness of her voice. She didn't ask questions. She didn't carry a clipboard. She brought crayons and paper, and in that first session she simply sat in the corner drawing circles. After she left, Ethan picked up the yellow crayon. He began drawing spirals. The next day he added lines, then light. He didn't speak to Edith for a week, but when he did, it wasn't about Tyler. It wasn't about the object or the hospital. It was about stars and candy, and how, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear songs from the cartoon he used to love. Edith never interrupted. She simply nodded and said, "That sounds heavy," or, "Thank you for sharing that light." Rachel watched heart-heavy with both grief and gratitude. She began attending private sessions with Edith, too, and for the first time she said it aloud. "I left him alone with Tyler, repeatedly. I was tired. I believed the excuses. I didn't want to see it." Edith didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "If someone else told you that story, someone you loved, what would you say to them?" Rachel hesitated. "I'd say they were trying their best, that they couldn't have known everything." Edith's gaze didn't waver. "Then let's start there." Healing wasn't linear. Rachel learned this quickly. There were nights Ethan couldn't sleep and days he didn't speak. But there were also mornings when he laughed at the nurse's clumsy jokes or asked to watch his favorite cartoon again. The kind of joy that flickered in broken places but still shone. Weeks passed. The hospital became a rhythm of gentle recovery. Visitors brought balloons. Cards arrived. Rachel read every message to Ethan even if he didn't respond. He kept one card beneath his pillow, a drawing from another child in the pediatric ward. A son with a smile. 3 stick figures holding hands. Underneath it, "You are strong." One Sunday, Rachel wheeled Ethan to the rooftop garden. The air was crisp, the sky wide and blue. Birds wheeled above in lazy arcs. He closed his eyes and turned his face toward the sun. She sat beside him quietly. He reached out slow, deliberate, and placed his hand over hers. "I don't think I'll forget," he said. She swallowed hard. "You don't have to, but—" "I think I'll still grow." Tears blurred her vision. "Yes, baby, you will." A breeze passed between them, lifting the edge of Ethan's blanket and carrying it gently to his lap. They stayed there for a long time. Just being. No need for explanation. No rush toward answers. Only the slow, deliberate act of choosing to heal. If this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of the strength inside broken places, please subscribe to our channel. Every follow helps us keep telling the stories that matter. The first morning home felt quieter than Rachel expected. The walls of their apartment didn't hum with the same fluorescent tension of the hospital. Instead, they echoed with a kind of stillness, a reverent hush that made each breath feel deliberate. Ethan stood in the doorway of his room, hesitant as if he wasn't sure whether the shadows there were old or new. His fingers trailed against the wall, brushing familiar textures, the posters, the shelf of forgotten books, the soft, threadbare blanket folded on his bed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He took a slow step in, and then another. By the time Rachel unpacked the last of his hospital bag, he was already curled in the corner of his bed sketchbook, open crayons strewn like candy across the sheets. She watched from the hall, heart fragile, holding herself still so the moment wouldn't shatter. It had been 6 weeks since the surgery. 6 weeks of therapy, of check-ins, of slow, fractured healing, and now they were home. But the truth was, home was not the same place they had left. Ethan had grown quieter, more deliberate. He no longer reacted with panic, but with pause. His smiles, though rare, were genuine. When he laughed, it was small, but it was real. The trauma had not vanished, but neither had his light. Rachel, too, had changed. She no longer rushed to fill the silences. She had learned to sit beside them, to let Ethan lead, to offer safety without demanding confession. One evening, she found herself cleaning out the hallway closet. At the very back, under an old blanket, she found a small box. She recognized it instantly, Tyler's. A cigarette lighter, a bottle cap, a photo from a trip they never finished. She hesitated, then closed the box. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't open it again. That night, Ethan climbed into bed beside her, not out of fear, but comfort. He didn't say a word. He simply lay his head on her shoulder and whispered, "The stars are still there." She nodded, too full to speak. The seasons began to change. In spring, Edith introduced Ethan to another child survivor. His name was Miguel. He was a year older, with a prosthetic arm and a mind full of poetry. The two boys didn't speak much at first, but one afternoon Rachel walked into the living room to find them drawing side by side. Spirals, constellations, bridges of light connecting their pages. In time, Ethan began attending art therapy twice a week. He painted rain in bold colors. He sketched dreams where birds flew from mouths instead of silence. He was learning to turn pain into palette. Rachel started journaling. It was awkward at first, her handwriting uneven, her thoughts scattered. But with each entry, she began to let go of the guilt. She began to remember that strength wasn't the absence of failure, but the choice to rise in spite of it. They planted a small garden on the balcony. Tomatoes, basil, a sunflower that reached for every ounce of sky. And one day Ethan hung a small sign next to the planter. Things grow again. It was simple. And it was everything. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of healing, in small victories, in new beginnings, please subscribe to our channel. Every story we share could be a light for someone still in the dark. 1 year later, Ethan stood in front of his school auditorium, a showcase for student art. He was wearing a gray sweater and holding a sketchbook. His palms were sweaty, but his eyes were steady. Rachel sat in the front row, heart thudding. He stepped forward and opened to a page. It showed a boy, small, hunched, shadowed, and beside him a woman holding a lantern. Below it, she showed me the way out. Rachel cried. Not the way she did in the hospital, not in despair, but in recognition, in awe, in love. Later that night, as they walked home beneath a sky studded with stars, Ethan looked up. "Do you think we could help other kids someday?" he asked. Rachel smiled. "I think we already are." They walked on two silhouettes woven together by threads of resilience, of grief, of unimaginable strength. The night no longer held menace. It held promise. Each step forward was a quiet act of defiance. Each breath a soft revolution. And though scars would remain, they would not define them. They had swallowed the burden, and now they were learning to speak. This is not just Ethan's story. It's the story of every survivor, every parent, every heart still learning to trust the morning. If it moved you, subscribe now and share this with someone who needs to know they are not alone.